Okay, shall we begin? Okay, we shall begin. Good evening, everyone. And we are
Good evening,
on.
ma'am.
Good evening, everyone. And
Good evening, ma'am.
yes, is someone saying anything?
Yes, ma'am. We are saying good evening, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, and good evening to all of you. And we shall begin with the last lecture of your series, lecture series. Okay, so we'll continue from where we left off. And we were basically talking about how Judith Butler argues her position. Because, she is a philosopher and who, speaking from a post-structuralist position, where she destabilizes the binaries within the gender discourse. And so we'll continue from her arguments. And this was just before, let's say, when we started talking about the points she takes up with regard to Beauvoir's views. Okay, so we were talking about how she does not accept, the stable category of woman. And according to Butler, there are always limits to identity politics. So she does not. She feels that. She argues that that the category of woman as a stable category stands contested, and if one conforms to a requirement, as she says, of representational politics, where the feminists try to talk about, or they speak for a stable subject, because she says that feminists, when they talk about representation in politics, or representational politics, they always argue for a stable subject, a stable category, the category of woman. And she says that when we set about inquiring, and when she herself talks about inquiring into the stable category of woman, she says that you find that it opens itself to charges of gross misinterpretation, because the question arises, which women, or who are these women that they are trying to represent. And but again, at the same time, there is also the view that one cannot refuse representational politics. And but the juridical structures of language, the structure of language and politics, they constitute, can one speak outside this field? The judicial structures of language as well as politics, they constitute the contemporary field of power. And in fact, there is no position where one can speak outside this field. Okay, so now what needs to be looked at, you see? So we always speak within, or one always talks about all of these issues within the structures of language and politics. And since there is no position outside the field, what one needs to look at, so how do you critique in that? If she has already stated, as there's no position outside that field, then how do you critique this? So she said what can be looked into is the genealogy, so basically tracing a line of descent, okay, of its legitimating process. Who legitimizes the category of woman? Who constructs the category of, gender or sex? Okay, so she raises questions about this legitimating process. Who legitimates this? Okay, and what should look at is how this legitimating process begins. So for her, so she, according to Butler, the task is to, formulate within this constituted frame a critique of the categories of identity that contemporary judicial structures, talk about as something given as very natural, and how they naturalize it, that these are the two divisions, the masculine or the feminine, or the male or the female, the two binaries. They always talk in terms of these two categories. So her idea is to, critique how these categories of identities are constructed and how do they make it appear as being very normal. This is what is absolutely natural. How do they naturalize it? What is it that makes us accept that these two binaries as being very natural? Okay. So according to the Butler, this is what she states, is hence we need to look beyond this, because so far whatever debates within feminist discourse had been taking place was within these two binaries. So hence her period is known as this post-feminist phase. Post-feminist phase where one needs to reflect from within a feminist perspective. You see, so she is not speaking from outside any position, but from within the feminist perspective on this injunction to construct a subject of feminism, that how these categories get constructed, and one needs to critique the construction of these categories or these binaries. So according to her, a radical rethinking is required, a rethinking of this, the construction of the category, the ontological category, the object of a study. Okay, the construction of identity becomes necessary. And why is this necessary? This is necessary in order to formulate a representational politics that might also revise, that might kind of revise other forms of look for other grounds for feminism to work on. This might revive feminism on on other areas, on other grounds, because she needs that we need to relook at the construction of these categories. So according to her, it is now time for feminist theory to free itself from the necessity of having to construct a single or an abiding ground which is always contested, because so far feminists had been talking about representational politics, or representation in politics for this category, or talking about feminist goals with respect to this category of women. But when this category of women stands contested, okay, from various identity positions, or those who do not accept what that category of woman defines, then naturally it is time. I mean, she suggests that it is time that for feminists to look into how the construction of these categories work, and that is the position from where she works. Okay. Then according to then what she goes on to say, that it is then is it an unwitting regulation of gender relations, that that is how it works, or that is how it should be. So isn't this also contrary to feminist goals, that one should also question, one needs to raise questions about about how these genders are fixed, that there is this regulation that this is how one must fit into either of the two genders. So so feminists should also question this, the need to question from this stance. So a new sort of feminist politics is desirable, to contest the way gender and identities are fixed, one that will take and so she suggests that one should go for, or one should go for these variable constructions of identity, instead of accepting the categories as being fixed. She suggests, or in her further arguments she goes on to talk about these variable constructions of identity, and both as a methodology, a way of approaching issues, instead of accepting the category of women as being fixed. She suggests or goes on to explore about how there can be variable constructions of identity, and that can be used as a methodology, and can be also seen as a a normative perspective. You can also see it from a different perspective, instead of simply accepting these two fixed binaries and interpreting or approaching anything from this perspective of having accepted the two binaries. So now she kind of tries to explain as to how, I mean, rather, let's say she poses a lot of questions as to how should then one go about, inquiring into, this or questioning or contesting these binaries. So she says, first of all, the task of a feminist should be the task of a feminist genealogy would be of the category of women would be to trace the political operations that produce and conceal what qualifies as the juridical subject of feminism. The first task of a feminist is to look at this, look at how, rather trace how these categories have been constructed, to trace the political and what are the political operations that take place, political operations that produce these two categories. So you go by a feminist genealogy. So Butler attempts, therefore, a feminist genealogy. So you see, so she's trying to understand how these binaries are made, okay, how these binaries are constructed. So she's going to look into these distinctions between, apart from the masculine and feminine that had already been, spoken about, right from Beauvoir. And now she would go on to see how the construction takes place. How do these binaries get constructed? And not just in terms of gender, but also when it comes to sex. Okay, comes to the male and the female bodies. So she attempts a feminist genealogy of the category of women. Okay, why? To trace the political operations that produce and conceal what qualifies as the juridical subject of feminism. So what are the political operations? How does this work that go on to, how does it actually go on to construct the category of women? And she will now go, she goes on in a genealogical, with a genealogical approach. So according to her, the identity of the feminist subject ought not to be the foundation of feminist politics, because you see, feminist politics take for granted the category of women. They do not look into how the category of woman gets constructed. So she now goes into, or her inquiry is into the constructedness of this category of women. Okay. So she begins by saying first that, there is somehow for feminists, they unproblematically accept the unity of women. Okay, and it is often, when we talk about women, we do not question, who these women are, which women are we talking about, who all are included within this category. So often this is taken as an unproblematic category, or there's this unproblematic unity of women is often spoken about, is often invoked. She says we take it for granted the category of women, and we see the category as, as there's nothing, as if there is nothing to be contested upon. But she says this, but this is what needs to be. This is she, let's say, goes on to further discuss. He says, but this split in the feminist subject had already been introduced before. He's saying we tend to accept that as, as a category. Let's say there is a unity when it comes to the category of women. We take it as being as one unified subject. But she says, but this split was introduced long before, okay, when Beauvoir made the distinction between sex and gender. So, okay, that unity had already been, the split had already taken place regarding this idea. When it comes to the issue of the category of women, the split had already happened when Beauvoir made the distinction between sex and gender. And why was this done? This was done to basically to dispute that biology is destiny formation, meaning because one is born with a, so-called female body, or with biological parts that what we call or ascribed to a woman. So it was taken for granted that the person would go on to perform the functions that has that that the body ought to be doing, or this is what the body should be doing. Okay, so biology, so because you're born with a male body, so you would want to perform the functions of what is expected of a male body, and similarly for a woman. So in other words, biology is destiny formulation. But this was exactly disputed when the split was made between sex and gender. So why? Because as Bohr proved, the gender is culturally constructed. That gender is not the result of causal result of sex. Sex meaning the biological aspect, meaning one born with a female anatomy, or one with a male anatomy. So it is not necessarily the result, because one born with one having a female body need not necessarily go on to develop or have so-called feminine characteristics. And if that happens, it is because of the social and culturally constructed characteristics that are imposed on this body. So that gender is neither the result of this, the causal result of sex, and neither it is fixed. This had already been proved. Okay. So then she says, so if we assume for a moment that that the stability of the binary sex, that it does not follow the meaning that all because one is born with a male body, because it need not necessarily fit into or have those masculine characteristics. And similarly, a woman born with a person with a male body or a female body need not necessarily go on to fit into, let's say, having those feminine characteristics. So it does not follow that the construction of men will accordingly act according to the bodies of the male. So construction of the idea of man will not necessarily fit into that of a male body. And similarly, the construction of a woman, that what a woman must be or should be, the so-called cultural constructions of woman need not necessarily be always interpreted with female bodies, because we already know that how these how gender is culturally constructed. And as the Bohr stated, one is not born a woman, but one becomes one. Okay, so all because uh, one may be born with different anatomy, with a female body, biological female body. So she it is through cultural compulsion that she has to fit into the category. She's socialization happens in such a manner that she has to fit into the idea of a woman, or have those feminine characteristics. And similarly, it is for male. But with this split, it has already been proved that it may not necessarily happen so. So you could have a girl who could be very tomboyish, or there could be a boy who could be very feminine in his behavior and attitude. So you see, so it has, because of this split, it was already proved that it does not have to correlate exactly with those, with either the male body or the female body. It need not necessarily, those characteristics, so-called cultural characteristics, need not exactly, relate to either of the bodies, the male body or the female body. So, but she says that even if we accept the binaries of sex, let's say, okay, there is a female body and a male body. She's saying there is, so therefore there is no reason to assume that genders also ought to remain as two. So since it may not correspond exactly to the same bodies, because not necessarily feminine characteristics would fit with the female body and masculine characteristics will fit with the male body, because it does not correspond in such a manner. So there is no reason to assume that the gender ought also to remain only as within these two categories. Okay, maybe it can be partly male and partly female, or more of the feminine, less of, you can think of so many combinations. It may not necessarily stick to, or it need not necessarily fit into just these two categories, just these two binaries. So he's saying if the presumption of a gender binary system, okay, if we take only these two categories, so the presumption of a gender binary system, you know implicitly somehow, it retains the belief that somewhere there is a mimetic relation of gender to sex. The very fact that we can think of in such terms, but the thinking is always within these two terms, so the feminine need not necessarily fit into a female body, or the masculine need not necessarily fit into a female body. It can be vice versa. Okay, so a masculine characteristics could be seen in a female body and feminine characteristics in a male. But the problem is, it is always within these two categories. We are discussing, or we talk only within these two binaries. So that means somewhere the relation is just it's mimetic. It is once again goes back to relating to these two sexes and to these two genders. So there is somewhere the implicit belief that there is a mimetic relation of gender to sex. So basically, gender, in a way mirrors sex, or is otherwise restricted by it. So it's not that it always relates to these sexes. So two categories of gender. It may not necessarily, but what happens is we see that it is within these. We think in terms of these two gender binaries, and obviously in that case, that means we relate it to the two sexes only. We restrict it to the sexes. So because the thing, the let's say. The argument that comes about is that because there are two sexes, hence we have two genders, but as we have just spoken about how gender, it may not necessarily correspond to the bodies. So that, but then genders, that means, are multiple interpretations of two sexes. Okay. So when we say that there are two sexes, it would mean that they are just two genders. But we know that genders again are multiple interpretations of the two sexes. Okay, so two sexes but multiple interpretations, we see gender as that. So when gender is theorized as culture, so when we talk about gender being a cultural construct, when it is theorized, is theorized as culturally constructed, and that means it does not really correspond to the two sexes. That means it is independent of sex. Because it does not have to exactly correspond to the two sexes. So in that case, when we talk about gender being a cultural construct, that means it is a free floating artifice, as she says. So, because it may need not, the gender need not correspond to that body, okay, to the respective to any particular body. So as a result of this, so man and masculine might not just easily signify, it might just as easily signify, it can refer to a female body just as a male one. Okay, so man and masculine could refer to not just to a male body, it could also refer to a female body, and vice versa also. Similarly, a woman and feminine may also refer not just to a female body, but also to a male body. You see? So you see how when we see gender as being culturally constructed, it need not only correspond to the respective bodies, but it can be applied to both. Okay, so feminine could refer to the female body, a female body could be feminine. Similarly, a male body could also be feminine. You see, so you see how when we see gender as culturally constructed, it becomes a free floating signifier. It can refer to any of the bodies, either the male body or the female body. Then she says, now after having spoken about the constructedness of gender, and that had already been spoken about earlier. Okay, this was not something new, that how gender is a construct had already been stated by Beauvoir. That statement had already been made. Now she goes on further. She says now there are further problems. She says now she comes to the issue of sex. Okay, so she says, what is sex anyway. Okay, she's referring to the body. Okay, and this is what her position is, that how she goes on to argue that not just gender is constructed, but also how even sex is constructed. Even the body is a product of discourse, the constructedness of sex. There is nothing called a given when it comes to sex. Okay, so the she raises quite a few questions. As a philosopher, they raise a lot of questions by way of arguments, so that they arrive at the point that she's trying to make. So she says that when we talk about sex, now is it natural? Is it natural? I mean, because a person born with particular sexual organs which naturally go on to perform what is expected of their body. Is it anatomical? Is it does just have to do with certain features of the body? Does this have to do with chromosomes? Is it chromosomal or hormonal? So how is a feminist critic? Okay, how is a feminist critic to assess the scientific discourses which purport to establish facts? So you think, who decided that this is a male body and this is a female body? So for a feminist, okay, how would a feminist critic, you know, look into the scientific discourses that, decided the facts for us, that this is the male body. And so, that is what she spoke about, the genealogy of, method, where you look into the discourses that decided, that made this decision that this is a female body and this is the male. Who brought before us, who established this fact before us or for us? Okay, so does this, making this distinction in sex, does sex have a history? Okay, is there a history about how this duality of sexes was established? That you have the male body and the female. Is there such a history? How was this established? And probably if we look into the genealogy, she says that this might expose the binary oppositions as a as a variable construction. Maybe this is also a variable construction. It is not really fixed. Okay, so if one were to look into the scientific discourses, probably one could also find, just as in the case of gender, as she already proved or already had been established, that it may not necessarily subscribe or correspond to that body. So maybe there were also such variable constructions could have been thought of or discussed when it came to deciding the two sexes or constructing the binaries of this sense. So probably that might also be found out. Okay, might expose the binary options, as a could be a variable construction. He's saying, and what if perhaps also, the idea that, that the character of sex cannot be destroyed. It is, she says, immutable. And what if this was contested? Perhaps this construct, she says, called sex, she suggests, is perhaps what we accept as the given male body of female. Perhaps this is also as culturally constructed as gender. Okay, so now she's already raising the point, as what if this is also the what we accept as natural, what we accept as given. Perhaps this is also culturally constructed just as gender is. And perhaps it was, or maybe it was always gender. What we talk about sex, okay, what we talk about the bodies, okay, when it the biological being, perhaps it was already gender. Hence the distinction between sex and gender. So the earlier on, where the distinction was made between sex and gender, probably there was no distinction at all. Sex itself was already gendered. In other words, what we thought as being given, or sex being biologically given, perhaps that is also already gendered. Okay, it is like gender already. It is, we always see it in gendered terms. So perhaps that was also already culturally constructed, which one did not look into. We accepted as been established by certain, scientific sources which established them as facts. But maybe they are not really facts, but they were also constructed through scientific discourses. So it's not just that gender is a construct, but equally sex is also a construct. And in that case, when we talk about the separation between sex and gender, maybe there is no separation at all. It is the same thing as gender. It is equally a construct. Therefore, she says that it makes, so the idea is, therefore, it makes no sense to define gender as the cultural interpretation of sex, because earlier what it was, that, okay, sex is given, and this is how culture constructs a gender. Gender is culturally constructed. So if one born with a female body is supposedly supposed to become a woman, and one with a male body is supposed to become a man, okay, having masculine characteristics. So these cultural interpretations of sex, this may be that sex itself is a gendered category. Okay. So now she makes, you see, so now she makes an advance on the earlier idea, what was seen as a distinction, where this was taken as the biological given as natural, and gender as being cultural construct, or let's say cultural interpretations of the sex. Now what she's saying, that maybe sex is also a cultural interpretation. You see, so sex is also not something given as facts, but something that is a cultural construction. So gender ought not to be conceived merely as a cultural inscription of meaning on a pre-given sex. Pre-given meaning, it already. Okay, we'll continue. Okay, so now what she argues is that gender ought not to, as I said, it ought not to be conceived only as the merely as the cultural inscription of meaning on a pre-given sex that do not impose meaning on a given pre-given sex already decided beforehand. Gender must also look at, must also designate the apparatus of production whereby these sexes are established. So what needs to look at is, what is this apparatus? Just as we said that gender is a cultural construct. When we talk about the constructedness of sex, what is this apparatus that produces? What is this cultural essence? It is a cultural apparatus that apparatus that produces this constructs gender. Similarly, one looks and needs to look at this apparatus that also constructs sex. So she goes further to say that gender must also talk about how the binary. So when we talk, gender must also talk about how the binaries of sex was established. How did this division, that's male body, female body, how did this take, how was this established? What were the scientific discourses that established the binaries of sex? And hence she goes on to point out that sex too is a constructed category, and hence the constructedness of sex. So it's not just that gender is a cultural construction, but also that sex, which was accepted as the biological, even this is a cultural construct. So as a result, when we always related gender to culture, that gender was a cultural construct and that sex is nature or natural, says now this cannot be accepted, as we can see that even sex is a cultural construct, and just as the gender is a cultural, or is also the discursive of cultural means by which the the so-called the sex nature or this natural sex is produced, and what is often she says is produced, and what is also established as pre-discursive, because when we were looking at how gender is culturally constructed, it gave the impression or idea that means the sex is already there, established. It's a pre-given. It is in a pre-discursive stage, before the discourse enters a discourse. It is in the pre-discursive. It is prior to culture. Okay. And as though this was a politically neutral surface on which, culture acts. So hence, when we talk about sex and gender, so gender is the stage where it is a cultural construction, and sex was relegated to the stage that it is in the pre-discursive domain, before it enters. It is not part of it is not a cultural construct. So then she questions that as to who decided that it should be in the pre-discursive stage. Why should it not be part of the, because now remember she's trying to bring it into that how it is also a construct of discourse. Okay, it is a product, it is a product, it is a product of discourse, and the constructedness is because of the discourse, but who put it in the pre-discursive domain? So one needs to look at this. Okay, so this is one point that she raised. So how is this how has this binary of sex has been maintained, and because this binary between sex and gender has been maintained by putting sex in the pre-discursive domain, and this production of sex as the pre-discursive, meaning not or outside the discoursive, this ought to be understood as the effect of the apparatus of cultural construction designated by gender. This is effect of that cultural apparatus that is produced by which has been designated by gender, and it is this apparatus that decides that gender is a cultural construction. So gender must then be reformulated. I mean, one needs to look at gender once again to include also to include or let's say at least include or look at the power relations that works behind this, that puts it into the pre-discursive. Who decides to put gender in the pre-discursive domain? Who decides that it should be because by putting it in the pre-discursive domain, the cultural apparatus that is designated by that constructs gender, it's the same apparatus, it's the same cultural apparatus that not just puts it in the pre-discursive domain, but it also conceals that how this operates, how this functions, or why it is put in this domain. Okay, then coming to she says that now if is there a gender, moving on to the next let's say step of argument. She says now is there a gender which persons are said to have, or is it an essential attribute that a person is supposed to be? Okay, is it something that one has it I mean, one appropriates that, or it is something an essence. It is an essential quality within that gender. A person has that to be. Okay, a person is said to be. So you see, when feminist theories claim that gender is culturally constructed, then of course the question arises: then what is the manner or mechanism of this construction? Because remember, she's raising questions about the constructedness of it. So having raised or brought about the issue of constructedness of sex, now, she also asks the question that what is the manner or mechanism of this construction? So if gender is constructed, could it be constructed differently? Or does it constructors imply some form of social? Now, what she suggests is that is there a certain social law that determines that this is how things ought to be? This is how gender divisions ought to be. Okay. So if it is a cultural construction, is there some kind of social determinism, as she says, a strong cultural law that determines that, or it is given that this is how things would work out or pan out. Okay. So does it mean that, there is no possibility, there is no way that a person can change that, transform that, no possibility of agency, meaning, okay, this is how things must work out between these two genders. This is how are the two gender divisions, and this is how things must work out. So does construction suggest that there are certain laws, certain laws that, that generate, certain social laws that generate gender differences, and this is universally there. I mean, it is all this kind of divisions is there universally. Okay. The sexual differences based on the sexes, there are these two differences, and this is universal everywhere. It is the same. Does it mean that, or and how and where does the construction, and when we talk about the construction, where does this construction of gender take place, and what sense can we make of a construction that, and he says, and after all, again, it is a human construction. Okay, because when we talk about the constructedness, who constructs? So that means there must be some human constructor who constructs. There are human beings who construct the categories of gender, or even when she talks about sex. Okay. So also, so what is suggested is that a gender is a construct, as a certain determinism of gender meanings, which is, that means that, these cultural meanings, or this, the gender meanings that, when we talk about the constructed of gender is like imposed on the bodies, and this is a law which is there, it is evident everywhere, and this is how it works. So, it raises, or these are the questions that come about. So if culture is so important, that means already what she has proved, that how gender gets constructed, and one needs to look at the construct, how this gets constructed. That means, and if there is this such a cultural, if culture is so important, that means if it is culture that decides, it is also important and powerful when it comes to constructing of gender. And she also goes on to talk about that of sex. That means it is so powerful, and so it is this culture that decides that gender is fixed and determined. So in that case, where earlier we saw that, where the it was biology that determined, that because there was this male body, it had to perform the functions of what a male body is expected to do, and if there is a female body, this is what it is supposed to do. So if we look at the constructedness of gender, and how we can also see that even sex is gendered, it also comes within the purview of being constructed. In that case, that means not biology, but it is culture is destiny. That means culture decides not just the gender, but also that of the sex. So that means it is already decided. So you see where she's trying to posit the not just the constructedness, but the the hegemony of culture, the domination where culture is in a powerful position, okay, which determines not just gender but also that of sex. So that means not so much as biology as destiny, but culture as destiny. So you see the how the importance of being a cultural construct. Okay, because why? It has already been decided by culture. In other words, that it has already been decided by culture that this is how it ought to be. Now, the two feminists whose ideas that she works on, we already referred to, Beauvoir, and she once again comes back to Beauvoir, and she says that when Beauvoir spoke about one is not born a woman but becomes one, she says that Beauvoir accepts that somewhere there is an agent, because when you say one becomes, that means an agency is being given to this person. Okay, it is not just given. So that means if somebody born with a female body goes on to become, that means there is agency given to this person who goes on to become a woman. Okay, so somewhere Beauvoir accepts that one has agency, one goes on to become. Second, she points out that the one who goes, this person who goes on to become, either takes on or appropriates that gender, meaning one becomes a woman under the compulsion of culture. Okay, that is what one goes on to become one, meaning one goes on to become a woman because of the compulsions of culture. Because remember, it is constructed by gender as being cultural construct, and one has to become one because under cultural constraints. Okay. But she's also, that means in other words also that the compulsion does not come from sex. Okay, so because remember she's a cultural cover, so one may be born with a male body, but one need not exactly have those masculine characteristics, and vice versa. One born with a female body need not necessarily always be feminine, and she could be very much, masculine in a. So the compulsion, that means, does not come from sex. Okay, so does this also mean that that person can also take on some other gender? Okay, that means born with a female body, but can go be very much masculine, and similarly vice versa. One born with a male could equally be masculine, vice versa. Does it also mean that this agent has to make a choice, okay, between the two, okay, because somewhere it is implied that you may be born with a female body, but you can choose to be masculine. And similarly, a man born with a person born with a male body can also choose. So this is the choice limited to only these two? Okay. So she inquires into all of this. So she says that in Beauvoir there is nothing to suggest that the one who becomes, and also when she says that one becomes one, he says there is nothing to suggest that one becomes a woman is necessarily female. Okay, it could be a male body which goes on to become a woman. Okay, so it does not necessarily mean, okay, a female body may go on to become a woman, but it could also mean that the male body may go on to become a woman. So she says that in Beauvoir there is nothing to suggest that that the one who becomes a woman is necessarily a female. So she's already kind of reading into what exactly into Beauvoir's statement. So according to Beauvoir, so if the body is the situation, so there is no help for the body, but always it has to be interpreted by these cultural meanings. So how does it not? So then, if that is the case, it has, if this has always has already been interpreted by cultural meanings, there is no other way, but you always go back to the body. There is no other, something else to refer to. It is, even if you were feminine, we go back to talking about these two bodies. So if there is no such any other option, that means how can we call it the pre-discursive domain? That means it is very much in the discursive domain. So here, so you see, this is the way she's interpreting. So hence, sex by definition, you see, says she's rereading into Beauvoir. She says, hence, sex by definition is gender all along, because it is not in the pre-discursive. It is already there in the discursive domain. So sex by definition is gender all along. Sex is also a cultural construct and not a neutral given. Okay, it is not something that is neutral. So it is already gender. Okay, so Butler Price basically tries to prove that sex is also a cultural construct. Okay, by moving further from Beauvoir's stance. Okay, and one of the and on the meaning of construction, she says, when one looks into philosophy, we often talk in terms of free will and determinism. I mean, how much does one really want to become that woman, and how much it is determined? Okay, she's saying usually this is one how argues in philosophy, but she's saying always there is this restriction of language, Okay, common linguistic restriction on thought. You know, it is the language that restricts your thoughts and limits to the terms of the debate. It is restricted within these. So what she points out, the restrictions. Remember, she was earlier talking about the judicial system. She now goes also to talk about the language limits the terms of the debate. You see, it has to be spoken between these two binaries. Okay, there is not something else that we can refer to. Okay, so and within these terms, in that case, if we only see it between these two terms, then what happens? We see the body as just being a passive medium on which the cultural meanings are imposed. So then, how does the body become gendered? Okay, how do we see the body no longer as a passive medium? Okay, that is what she points out. Okay. How does one see it as no longer as a passive medium? So you see there are the limits are set by culture, and this is in terms always of the hegemonic cultural. It is the hegemonic cultural discourse that sets that limits the terms of debate, that restricts it from being discussed in other things. So what she is doing is she's critiquing the hegemonic cultural discourse where the terms of debate is always between these two binaries. And he's saying even when one talks about, as she said earlier, that one may have a female body but have the other kind. He's saying, but it is always in relation to the other sex. It is always in terms of the other. It is between the two. There is no other way to relate. Okay, so it is always between there is all it is always in terms of the other. Okay, so this is what she points about Beauvoir, that when Beauvoir talks about the masculine and the feminine, okay, or the gender construct, it's always seen in terms of the other. Okay, the self and the other, always the masculine being defined, the feminine being defined in relation to the. So it is always in relation to another. Okay, it will be basically between two opposing significations, just between the two binaries. Okay, so this is how she kind of relooks into Beauvoir's statement and points out the limits of the discourse. Okay, that it is restricted within these two binaries. Remember, she is trying to deconstruct these two binaries. Moving on to that, she now goes on to take up the discussion of Luce Irigaray, okay, another French feminist, and you know that her work is essentially on the language. Okay, her work basically focuses she Luce Irigaray basically how she looks at it. She takes up the position of women in language. She says that that women within language, okay, which she says basically being masculinist, and in that in this masculinist construction of language, women often constitute the unrepresentable. Woman cannot be represented. So she says, she says in her work, the sex which is not one. Okay, she says that they cannot be represented. Okay, so usually she again picks up Irigaray's idea to advance her views that they cannot be represented as one. They are the unrepresented, and they are almost often represented as a linguistic absence. She refers to the female anatomy when she argues about how women is constituted within language. Women as being seen as a lack, as linguistic absence, as being opaque, or the opacity because of the linguistic absence. Basically, the impossibility of women being represented as one. Okay, and why does she point out this way? Basically because of the discourse being essentially masculinist. being phallogocentric, centered around the phallus. So being a phallogocentric discourse, in that case, often the the feminine, okay, they cannot be represented adequately within this discourse, okay, because it is within the masculine, essentially, they constitute a circle of signifier and signified unit. It is within these two terms, and it is within that it cannot be the woman cannot be constituted within that language. So there is, and Butler goes on. So there is, this illustrates, a problematic circulatory, she says, of a feminist inquiry into gender. And one can see that, when one looks at the views of Luz Irigaray, this helps Butler to advance her idea, where essentially, because the subject in when we talk about the women being constituted in language, or constituted in language, what happens that when a person is positioned within the language as a subject, it is essentially, in that case, woman as a subject constituted within a masculinist discourse is essentially then a masculinist construction, okay, and it is a prerogative of the male, the masculinist position, which what it does is also, leaves out, it excludes a lot of things, and it cannot, does not, it does not, and it is not possible to actually adequately represent the woman, because it is essentially a masculinist discourse. So they are, and they cannot be represented as one. Okay, so remember initially when we spoke about Butler contesting the category of woman as being one, as being unity. This idea kind of supports. Argument furthers Butler's views that Luz Irigaray's position when it comes to women, the constitution of women in language. Okay, so therefore, what Irigaray, though Irigaray, what she does is essentially she broadens the scope of feminist critique. She exposes the masculinist, signifying economy, she says, how it constructs within a very limited space, and so it identifies it identifies the the masculine signify as it's being as being monolithic. It is it's the one way. It is essentially the masculinist discourse that becomes monolithic. It becomes monologue. It's from one aspect, one perspective. So they are not, they do not adequately represent, and neither is the woman can be adequately represented. Okay, and she says if a woman were to let's say she says that the feminist critique also needs to explore not just the claims of the masculine, when the masculinist, the totalizing claims of the masculinities, the signification, the way it's signified. It also, because she says that if again feminists, if they again posit a single unified one subject, what happens in that case? It imitates the oppressor. So it is, you become almost the same as the oppressor, just as the masculinity discourse constructs the other. Similarly, it would be the same if they were to construct or present themselves as one. So the effort is to identify the enemy as singular in form. You know, if you see them also as one category, as one unified category, would again be in a way, the same thing in a reverse manner. It would be a reverse discourse, and it would simply mean that it copies the strategies of the oppressor instead of offering, a completely different set of terms. Okay, so the idea should not be, to imitate the strategies of the masculinist discourse, but to offer a completely different set of terms. Okay, so basically she's also Irigaray also raises the question of the universality of the female identity, as well as of the masculine, of masculinist oppression. So is that how should this be constituted, and that it should not imitate that of the same masculinist discourse. So what Butler arrives at, however, after having, taken up ideas both from Beauvoir, what is implied in Beauvoir's statement, and from what Irigaray states, she supports a model of coalitional politics. Okay, where there is, women positioned differently, and they articulate separate identities. So you see, so she tries to break down the binaries, and she talks about a coalitional politics, coalitional politics where women of separate identities, they are able to articulate from different positions. Okay, and uh, with the political intent. And for her, what she also suggests, that however this it may give the impression that this would again support one kind of a solidarity or a unity for any political action, but she argues that, it may be short term, it may be only done for a short term, and it should, it should look into the power relations that limit, coming together of various separate identities, or look for the power relations that, limit the possibilities. So she believes that, she does not, let's say again, posit a single one category, but a category where it is a coalition of varied separate identities, and something that is not there for a, fixed, let's say, advance of fixed, let's say, position, and it is basically an assemblage of positions, and that is temporary, that is of a fragmented nature. Okay, you can see that basically very post-structuralist stance she takes, and something that is always changing. It need not stay the way it is. That solidarity or the unity, there is always, and the category, the group also need not always be complete. There is a sense of incompleteness, also an approach that it is, that questions the foundation of these the anti-foundationalists in its approach. Okay, so she suggests a model, a coalition model, which is also, as I said, anti-foundationalist. Why? Because she supports the idea that gender is a complexity, and where arriving at one complete position to a totality is always, permanently deferred. It is not yet there. I mean, it is always deferred, never fully what it is at any given point of time. And it should be an open coalition that will affirm identities, okay, that are alternately, they are, they set up, and again they are, done away with. Okay, so depending upon being very contingent, depending upon what the needs of them accordingly, that is all the time being formed. Okay, so not something that is already there or would always be, but something that is always trying to arrive at. Okay, so an open assemblage which permits of various convergence, multiple convergences and without obedience, she says, to a particular a normative, closure of a normative form or an idea. Okay, so this is the main idea that she advances in her essay, and I think this is what is actually prescribed for your not really till the end. So this is how, let's say, finally the idea that she suggests is that of such an assemblage of coalitional, different separate identities, kind of a coalitional politics.
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt you in between.
Yes.
Actually, I would like to give a vote of thanks on behalf of all my research scholars, all the research scholars. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your unwavering attention throughout this lecture. I would like to express the gratitude to you, ma'am, for this commendable piece of lecture. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.